They say no one dares to touch her. Ethan Carter muttered under his breath, the words almost lost in the howl of wind across the barren plateau. Yet he couldn't look away from the glimmer beneath the wreckage. The sun was just a pale streak on the horizon, casting long shadows over jagged metallic debris, and the smell of scorched sand mixed with ozone from the shattered energy cells made his stomach twist. But his boots crunched forward anyway, each step deliberate, careful, calculating the uneven terrain, the jagged edges of broken panels and scattered circuits threatening to trip him. Yet his eyes remained fixed on her. Nira Solis, the forbidden, her skin a delicate iridescent green that shimmered even in the fading light, eyes wide and luminous, reflecting both fear and defiance, crouched against a bent support strut, trying to push herself from the wreckage that pinned her small frame, and Ethan could see every detail. The faint scorch marks across her shoulders, the fine dust settling in her silver-blue hair, the subtle tremble of her hands as they gripped the warped metal, her gaze darting toward the distant ridge, unsure, wary, yet daring to hope. Ethan knelt, feeling the coarse grains of sand pressing through his gloves, the heat of the late afternoon sun warming his back, the tactical display on his wrist flickering as it struggled to compensate for the environmental interference. Yet he ignored it, focusing solely on the task ahead, reaching out carefully to lift a piece of metal just enough to ease her position without startling her, and she flinched, drawing in a sharp breath, whispering something in her tongue that the translator rendered as "leave me." But Ethan only shook his head, voice calm, firm, but gentle. "I'm not leaving you." And the sound seemed to hang in the air between them, the way the light reflected off the shards of metal creating small bursts of rainbow, catching in Nira's eyes and making them widen in recognition, a silent acknowledgement of someone who saw her beyond the label, beyond the warning, beyond the word forbidden. He could feel the tension, the air charged, the weight of decisions pressing on him, yet the simplicity of action, lift, shift, support, guide, was all that mattered. The hum of distant machinery and the faint scrape of metal punctuating each motion, the rhythm of breathing between them sinking imperceptibly, a quiet trust beginning to form as she let him guide her a few steps, adjusting her stance carefully, eyes still wary but less hostile, watching him with an intensity that said she was measuring, calculating, wondering if the human before her was truly as reckless or as sincere as he appeared. And Ethan could only think, this is why we survive, why we move forward, not through weapons or technology, but through small acts, patience, presence, and a willingness to step into uncertainty for someone else's sake. And as the sun dipped lower, bathing the sand in molten amber, he carried her toward a shadowed cluster of twisted hulls that could serve as shelter, her fingers brushing against his arm almost by accident, fleeting, but enough to cement the fragile connection, a spark in the vast emptiness. And he realized that this moment, precarious and uncertain, might be the first step in something neither of them could have predicted. The cluster of twisted hulls provided a narrow but sufficient shelter from the searing wind. Ethan Carter carefully guided Nira Solis into the shallow alcove, the metallic surfaces reflecting streaks of the fading sun, creating small pools of color on the sand around them. He crouched beside her, his armored gloves brushing lightly over the dust and grit as he pulled a compact thermal blanket from his pack, unfolding it with precise, deliberate movements while his eyes flicked to every corner of the surrounding wreckage, scanning for signs of movement or disturbance, the faint hum of distant power relays filling the air. Nira shifted uncomfortably at first, the strange sensation of trust in another being foreign, her iridescent green eyes narrowing as she studied him, trying to detect motives or weakness, and Ethan noticed, almost imperceptibly, the tension easing from her shoulders, the way she allowed herself a few deep breaths, inhaling the smell of ozone and sand, a scent so alien yet grounding. He pulled a small medkit from his side pouch, carefully checking the instruments and vials, the tiny indicators blinking in rapid sequence, and began assessing minor abrasions and burns on her arms and legs, explaining each step in a calm, deliberate tone that cut through the chaos and made Nira listen, her gaze locking with his, absorbing every word, her pulse visible beneath the delicate shimmer of her skin. a subtle rhythm in tune with the slow, methodical pace of his actions. As he worked, Ethan spoke softly about the environment, pointing to the fractured panels and twisted metal, the color shifts in the sky, the faint echo of distant energy sources, attempting to provide context and comfort, while Nira, initially reluctant, began to respond with small gestures, tilting her head to observe, brushing back a strand of silver-blue hair, and even offering a soft, almost inaudible acknowledgement that she understood the care and attention he provided, the unspoken message of reliability and patience resonating. Through the harsh landscape, hours passed in relative quiet, punctuated by the gentle rustle of the blanket, the faint clicking of his instruments, and the occasional low hum of the thermal units he had set up to maintain a tolerable temperature, the setting sun casting long, shifting shadows that moved across the sand like liquid gold, and Nira, for the first time since the crash, allowed herself to lean against him slightly, not for comfort alone, but as a tentative trust, her eyes flickering toward the horizon, alert yet less tense, considering the possibility that she was not as alone as she had believed, that someone from another world could act with such integrity and care. Ethan observed this quietly, adjusting the blanket around her, reinforcing her protection without touching unnecessarily, his words minimal but deliberate, offering reassurance, guidance, and small observations that kept her mind focused and calm. The shared silence punctuated only by breathing and the subtle shift of sand beneath them, creating an intimate yet safe space within the chaotic environment. And as night slowly descended, stars emerging one by one over the vast desert, their light refracting off metallic fragments in soft glimmers, a fragile bond formed, an unspoken promise of vigilance and protection, the kind of connection born from actions and care rather than words, leaving both aware that the coming hours would test their trust and resolve in ways neither could yet predict. The night deepened over the desert, a thin crescent moon casting pale light on the scattered wreckage. Ethan Carter adjusted the small portable lights he had rigged around the alcove, their soft glow reflecting off Nira Solis's iridescent skin, highlighting the subtle contours of her shoulders and the fine shimmer in her hair as she moved slightly to test her mobility, her fingers brushing against the thermal blanket he had wrapped around her, the smallest gesture of comfort that seemed to acknowledge his presence without words. He watched her carefully, noting the slight relaxation in her posture, the way her eyes tracked his movements not with suspicion but with cautious curiosity, and he spoke softly, narrating the environment, pointing out the distant ridges that caught the moonlight, the shifting shadows across sand and metal, the faint hum of the distant energy cells that had not yet cooled, creating a rhythm that both grounded and focused her attention. And Nira listened, her breathing gradually sinking with his measured cadence, the initial tension in her shoulders easing, the sharp edges of fear rounding into something more like awareness and tentative trust. Ethan then guided her through small exercises, simple steps across uneven sand, teaching her to use balance and weight subtly against the debris, adjusting her stance with gentle but precise motions, all while keeping his own body positioned to provide stability and reassurance, his gloved hands never imposing but present. And Nira, for the first time, allowed herself to respond, leaning into his support slightly, her eyes reflecting the flickering lights and something more intangible, a realization that someone outside her world could act with unwavering care, without expectation of reward or status. The hours moved forward in silent cooperation, punctuated by small adjustments, whispered instructions, and the ambient noise of the desert night, the occasional scrape of metal or distant shift of sand adding texture to their shared space. And Ethan noticed her gaze softening, the guarded edge in her voice dissolving when she asked a question about the stars above, the constellations partially obscured by shifting dust and remnants of storm, and he answered, drawing parallels between the celestial patterns and subtle movements of the wreckage, turning a hostile, foreign environment into something she could comprehend, giving her agency and focus in a place that had seemed hopelessly alien. As they continued, the sheltering wreckage and faint protective glow of the lights created a microcosm where fear gave way to comprehension, and Ethan realized that his actions, deliberate and patient, were bridging a gap between worlds, teaching Nira not only to move but to observe, to trust, to accept the presence of another who would not abandon her. And as the night sky stretched overhead, vast and unknowable, there was a quiet understanding forming, a shared rhythm of breath, glance, and subtle motion that promised the fragile beginnings of alliance, trust, and something that neither could yet name, leaving both poised on the edge of a new chapter in a landscape that had once offered only danger and uncertainty. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and pale violet, and Ethan Carter could feel the subtle shift in temperature as the air cooled, the metallic fragments around them catching the early rays in a delicate shimmer, illuminating the jagged edges and casting intricate patterns of shadow across the sand. Nira Solis moved cautiously, testing her balance as she stepped onto the uneven surface of the wreckage, the faint crunch of sand beneath her feet, mingling with the low hum of the distant energy sources still lingering from the destroyed shuttle, and Ethan remained close, guiding her with measured gestures, his voice calm and steady as he pointed out safer footing, occasionally describing the landscape beyond, the ridges and valleys that caught the sunlight and the gentle arcs of wind shifting the dust, giving her a sense of continuity and orientation in an otherwise chaotic environment. She listened, the tension in her shoulders slowly uncoiling, her eyes scanning the environment with growing awareness, noticing details she had previously overlooked, the glint of a reflective panel, the way light refracted through fragments of transparent material, the subtle heat signatures that hinted at movement of distant wildlife. And Ethan encouraged her to observe, to notice the rhythm of the environment, to anticipate changes rather than react in fear, reinforcing her confidence and focus. As they moved together, Ethan maintained a steady pace, adjusting the blanket to shield her from sharp edges and dust, his hands hovering near but not imposing, communicating presence and support without intrusion, and Nira began to mirror his movements, trusting his guidance, her breath gradually falling into a synchronized cadence with his own, the air between them carrying a quiet tension and anticipation, the shared silence punctuated by the soft creak of metal and the whisper of sand shifting beneath their feet. He spoke occasionally of the constellations appearing above, linking them to landmarks and features around them, turning abstract observations into practical navigation cues, allowing Nira to feel engaged, capable, and grounded, transforming her fear into curiosity, and the subtle change in her expression reflected a cautious optimism, her posture slightly more upright, her steps more deliberate, her fingers brushing over surfaces with intent rather than apprehension. The soft glow from Ethan's portable lights mingled with the first natural light, casting elongated shadows and warm tones on their surroundings, and they found a relatively sheltered area where the debris formed a natural alcove, enough to provide respite, where he adjusted her position, ensuring comfort while continuing to narrate the environment, pointing out subtle details of the sand patterns, the angles of fallen panels, and distant silhouettes against the rising sun, fostering a connection through observation and shared awareness, a mutual trust building quietly, steadily, as the morning unfolded, leaving both of them alert, engaged, and cautiously optimistic about the journey ahead, each step forward reinforcing the fragile but growing bond between human and alien, trust and guidance interwoven as they prepared to face the challenges the desert would continue to present. The rising sun stretched its first warm rays across the desert landscape, casting long, intricate shadows over the jagged metal fragments and the shifting dunes, and Ethan Carter carefully led Nira Solis through the shallow alcove toward a slightly higher ridge that offered a clearer view of the horizon, his boots crunching over sand mixed with small shards of glassy debris, each step deliberate to maintain balance while guiding her. And he spoke softly, describing the distant terrain, the changing colors of the sand, and the faint glimmers of distant structures, helping her interpret the environment while reinforcing trust through observation. Nira followed cautiously, her iridescent green skin reflecting the morning light, the subtle shimmer revealing muscles tensing and relaxing as she adjusted to each movement, and she began to respond to his instructions with small shifts in weight and balance, testing the guidance he provided and gradually finding confidence in her own mobility, her eyes tracking his gestures and the subtle cues he offered, noticing patterns in the sand and the angles of fallen panels, absorbing information and translating it into actions without needing constant direction. Ethan maintained a careful rhythm, alternating between movement and pauses, allowing her to catch her breath and internalize each adjustment, while gently pointing out minor obstacles and safer paths. His voice calm, deliberate, and full of steady assurance, providing both instruction and moral reinforcement that encouraged her to rely on observation, timing, and awareness rather than fear. The faint hum of residual energy from the wreckage mixed with the soft rustle of the wind, creating a layered auditory backdrop that accentuated their connection and focus, and Nira's initial wariness slowly gave way to his subtle engagement. Her glances toward Ethan revealing curiosity and the faintest hint of appreciation for his patience and deliberate care, a silent acknowledgement forming that trust could exist even between beings from different worlds. As they reached a small plateau partially shielded by twisted panels and reflective debris, Ethan guided her to a position that offered stability and a sense of control, allowing her to steady herself, the cool morning air carrying fine particles of sand that danced around them in delicate arcs, catching the sunlight and reflecting tiny bursts of color across her shimmering skin, reinforcing the beauty and alien nature of her form while grounding her in the immediate environment. He took a moment to observe her posture, adjusting the thermal blanket around her shoulders and offering minimal, precise guidance, his voice describing distant landmarks and subtle changes in terrain, building her awareness and reinforcing the emerging pattern of trust and collaboration. And Nira responded with small shifts, leaning slightly on his support when necessary and withdrawing when confident, a rhythm forming between them that spoke of mutual reliance, awareness, and tentative connection. Together they surveyed the landscape, the vastness of the desert stretching beyond them with its dunes, debris, and faint glimmers of heat ripples, and the morning light gradually revealing the contours of a path that might allow safe passage, while the shared silence, punctuated only by the soft movement of sand and occasional low hum of residual energy, created a sense of intimacy and cooperation, both aware that each step forward was a choice, a test, and a lesson in patience, observation, and trust, leaving them prepared to face whatever the day might bring, while deepening the fragile bond between human and alien. The sun climbed higher, the heat of the desert rising and mingling with the metallic tang of the wreckage, and Ethan Carter could feel beads of sweat forming along his brow as he guided Nira Solis across the uneven terrain toward a small cluster of twisted panels that offered partial shade and a more stable footing, his voice steady and deliberate as he described each step, each ridge, each subtle change in elevation so that she could anticipate the terrain rather than react in uncertainty. And Nira, her green skin shimmering softly in the morning light, followed closely, eyes scanning every detail, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm when she needed support, a quiet acknowledgement of his guidance and presence. He encouraged her to move at her own pace, offering reminders about weight distribution and balance, describing the patterns of the sand, the way shadows lengthened and shifted with the rising sun, the distant glimmer of heat across the dunes, all while keeping the ambient sounds, the soft hum of distant machinery, the whisper of wind through fractured panels, the occasional rustle of shifting debris, as cues for her attention, creating a layered sensory environment that helped her build confidence and situational awareness. As they progressed, Ethan set up small markers with reflective strips, subtly indicating safer paths and slight variations in incline, demonstrating how to interpret visual cues in a landscape that was both alien and treacherous. And Nira observed keenly, learning to anticipate rather than react, her movements becoming more deliberate and her steps more assured, each successful adjustment reinforcing a growing trust in both her own abilities and Ethan's guidance. They paused atop a gently sloping rise, the view stretching across the desert, panels and metal shards catching sunlight in scattered iridescent flashes. And Ethan spoke softly of the distant horizon, the shapes of ridges and dunes, the interplay of light and shadow, turning abstract visual information into navigational context. And Nira listened intently, her posture upright, her breathing steady, reflecting an emerging rhythm of awareness and attentiveness, the subtle shift from apprehension to focused engagement apparent in every line of her body. As the morning progressed, Ethan guided her through careful exercises in balance and orientation, gently adjusting her stance, reminding her to observe and predict movement, providing a steady cadence of instruction and reinforcement, while Nira gradually mirrored his motions, her confidence growing, her eyes flicking from his gestures to the landscape, interpreting subtle details, and anticipating the safest next step, the unspoken connection between them strengthening through shared attention and deliberate movement. By midday, the small alcove offered a shaded respite where they could pause, Ethan adjusting the thermal blanket around her shoulders, reminding her to conserve energy, to hydrate, and to maintain focus on the details of the environment. The shimmering heat rising from the sand forming mirages in the distance, and together they surveyed the surrounding terrain, each aware of the challenges ahead, the rhythm of their movements, the synchrony of their attention, and the quiet but growing trust that formed the foundation for the fragile alliance between human and alien in a vast and unpredictable world, leaving both poised to continue their journey with awareness, patience, and a shared sense of cautious optimism. The afternoon sun beat down on the desert, casting harsh golden light across the dunes and fractured wreckage, and Ethan Carter adjusted the straps of his pack as he guided Nira Solis along a narrow ridge, the metallic fragments glinting sharply and small dust particles rising with each careful step, the air thick with heat, and the faint smell of ozone from the residual energy cells. He spoke in measured tones, pointing out subtle patterns in the sand and metal, teaching her to anticipate changes in elevation and texture, to notice the way shadows shifted across the debris, and Nira followed closely, her posture gradually relaxing as she absorbed each instruction, her green eyes bright and alert, tracking his movements and the terrain with growing confidence, every small adjustment of her balance reflecting increasing trust in his guidance. Ethan paused occasionally to indicate a safer path, using hand gestures and brief, clear explanations, allowing her to internalize each lesson, and the rhythm of their steps began to synchronize, the sound of sand shifting and metal creaking providing a subtle cadence that guided their pace, reinforcing a shared awareness of environment and movement. As they navigated the ridge, Nira began experimenting with slight shifts in weight and stance, learning to predict the behavior of unstable surfaces, and Ethan encouraged these small risks, correcting gently when necessary, praising her observations, and pointing out details in the patterns of reflected light and the subtle colors in the sand that could indicate loose footing or hidden obstacles. The wind carried fine grains of sand that sparkled in the sunlight, swirling around them in delicate arcs, and Ethan drew her attention to these movements as indicators of air currents and terrain shifts, helping her develop an intuitive sense of environmental interaction, while also reinforcing the importance of patience, observation, and careful decision-making. In moments of rest, they crouched among the larger fragments, Ethan sharing quiet observations about distant ridges, angles of fallen panels, and subtle cues in the landscape that might suggest the safest route forward, and Nira listened intently, her breathing steady, her gaze absorbing every detail, the initial fear in her expression replaced with a thoughtful focus, the tiniest hint of a smile betraying her growing confidence. Together they moved with a deliberate, cautious rhythm, each step forward reinforcing the fragile but strengthening bond between them, their awareness of each other's movements, gestures, and timing creating a silent communication, a trust built not on words but on shared experience and careful guidance. And as the sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows that stretched across the desert like liquid gold, they paused on a plateau, surveying the terrain ahead, both alert, focused, and aware that the lessons of the ridge, the observation of detail, and the mutual support they had cultivated would be essential for navigating the challenges that still lay ahead, a quiet understanding passing between them that each step taken together was a step towards something larger, a fragile but growing alliance forged in patience, attentiveness, and the simple acts of presence and care. The late afternoon sun cast long, shifting shadows across the dunes and scattered wreckage, and Ethan Carter carefully led Nira Solis along a gently sloping ridge that overlooked the surrounding expanse, his gloved hands guiding her balance. Subtly as he described the terrain, noting subtle shifts in the sand and the angles of metallic fragments that caught the sunlight, creating tiny flashes of color and light to mark safer footing. Nira's iridescent green skin glimmered softly, her eyes scanning each step in the distant horizon, adjusting instinctively to his cues, and she began to move with more confidence, testing her weight distribution and observing the way the light shifted across surfaces, learning to anticipate hazards rather than react to them, the trust between them deepening with every careful step. Ethan spoke in calm, deliberate tones, pointing out distant formations, the subtle curves of dunes, and reflective surfaces that indicated uneven footing, encouraging her to focus on observation, to notice patterns in the landscape, and to rely on sensory input rather than fear. And Nira absorbed each instruction, her posture gradually relaxing, her breathing steadying, the faint tension in her shoulders giving way to controlled awareness, each movement a reflection of growing skill and confidence. As they traversed the ridge, Ethan set up small markers with reflective strips that caught the fading sunlight, demonstrating how to interpret visual cues in a challenging environment, and Nira followed, noting the placement and reasoning behind each marker, internalizing not only his instructions but also the method behind them, her movements becoming more fluid and precise, the rhythm of her steps aligning with his guidance, the unspoken communication between them forming a steady cadence that reinforced trust and cooperation. The wind carried fine grains of sand that sparkled as they swirled around them, and Ethan drew her attention to the subtle shifts, using them to indicate air currents and possible loose surfaces, enhancing her awareness of the environment, while Nira responded with careful adjustments, testing her balance and incorporating the new observations into her movements. Her confidence evident in the way she shifted her weight and maintained her stance with minimal reliance on his direct support. They paused briefly on a small plateau partially shaded by jagged metal fragments. Ethan adjusting the thermal blanket around her shoulders and ensuring her footing was secure, while speaking softly about distant ridges, the angles of scattered panels, and the patterns in the sand that indicated stability, fostering both her confidence and situational awareness. The ambient sounds of the desert, the faint hum of residual energy from the wreckage, the rustle of sand, the distant echoes of shifting debris provided a textured backdrop for their focused activity, and Nira's attention remained sharp, her eyes scanning for detail, her mind integrating the sensory information into predictive responses, demonstrating the growing synergy between observation, learning, and trust. As the sun continued to lower, the light reflected off the metallic fragments and sand, creating a kaleidoscope of glimmers that danced across the ridge, and Ethan observed Nira's posture, noting the subtle cues of growing skill, her deliberate steps, and the quiet acknowledgement in her gaze, signaling that she was not only following guidance but also beginning to understand the principles of movement, balance, and awareness, preparing them both for the next stage of their journey through the vast, unpredictable desert landscape. Their connection strengthened by patience, careful instruction, and shared focus. The golden light of late afternoon stretched across the dunes, casting long, wavering shadows over the fractured metal and sand, and Ethan Carter led Nira Solis toward a series of low ridges that promised a clearer route through the desert, his movements deliberate and precise as he guided her step by step, adjusting her stance when necessary and pointing out subtle changes in the slope, hidden dips, and the angles of debris that could shift unexpectedly underfoot. Nira's iridescent green skin caught the sunlight, her eyes scanning the terrain with alert focus, noting every detail Ethan indicated, from the faint reflective glint of metallic shards to the subtle texture differences in the sand, gradually moving from cautious hesitation to confident assessment, her steps more assured, her movements smoother, her breathing steady, reflecting the growing awareness and trust. Between them, Ethan continued his calm narration, explaining the patterns of the wind across the dunes, the heat mirages rising over distant ridges, and the slight bends in the landscape that suggested safer paths, using the natural light and shadow to demonstrate how to interpret environmental cues. while subtly reinforcing principles of patience, observation, and deliberate action, all of which Nira absorbed with a quiet intensity, her gaze flicking from his gestures to the surrounding landscape, internalizing lessons that extended beyond mere movement to a deeper understanding of the terrain and her own capacity to adapt. As they paused briefly atop a modest rise, Ethan adjusted the thermal blanket around her shoulders, keeping her comfortable while pointing out distant landmarks and the gentle curvature of sand dunes that would guide the next segment of their journey. His voice calm but infused with subtle reassurance, conveying both instruction and steady companionship. And Nira leaned lightly into his support, her small gestures signaling acknowledgement and a tentative sense of reliance without words. The soft hum of residual energy from scattered panels mingled with the whisper of wind, the occasional scrape of shifting debris, and the distant flicker of sunlight across metallic surfaces, creating a layered auditory and visual landscape that anchored their attention and reinforced situational awareness. And Nira began to anticipate subtle environmental changes, adjusting her steps and balance proactively, a quiet smile flickering across her lips as she realized the value of observation and the presence of a guide she could trust. Together they continued along the ridge, each step measured and intentional, their movements forming a synchronized rhythm of attention and coordination, Ethan providing the framework for movement, Nira responding with growing independence, and the interplay between instruction, observation, and action deepening their connection, establishing not only trust and cooperation but also a shared understanding of the desert environment, the intricate patterns of light and shadow, and the subtle language of terrain that would sustain them for the challenges still ahead, leaving both alert, engaged, and quietly confident as the day edged toward evening. The vast, unpredictable landscape stretching before them, yet made navigable through patience, awareness, and the careful partnership they had built. The late afternoon light softened into warm amber, stretching long shadows across the dunes and fractured wreckage, and Ethan Carter guided Nira Solis down a gentle slope that offered a clearer vantage point of the surrounding terrain, his voice calm and steady as he described the subtle variations in elevation, the faint glimmer of metallic debris catching the light, and the shifting angles of sand that indicated stability or potential hazards. Nira's iridescent green skin caught the muted sunlight, her eyes scanning every detail, observing patterns in the sand, the position of reflective fragments, and the faint lines of wind currents that shaped each step, adjusting her weight and stance with increasing precision as she integrated Ethan's guidance into her own perception, her breathing steady, movements deliberate, and her trust in him growing with each cautious step. Ethan paused occasionally to point out distant landmarks and subtle changes in the ridge, explaining how the interplay of shadow and light could reveal hidden dips or gentle inclines, reinforcing her observational skills and encouraging proactive assessment. While keeping the pace measured to maintain balance and energy, the gentle hum of residual energy from scattered panels mingling with the whisper of wind, creating a layered rhythm that both anchored their focus and reinforced the cadence of movement between them. As they advanced, Ethan guided her through exercises in anticipation, teaching her to recognize patterns in terrain and predict subtle shifts in footing, providing encouragement through brief affirmations, and Nira responded with careful adjustments, stepping lightly, testing her balance, and incorporating each lesson, the developing synchronization of their movements creating a sense of quiet cooperation and shared awareness, a rhythm that spoke of growing confidence and mutual understanding. The distant ridges appeared to stretch endlessly, and Ethan directed her attention to the gentle curvature of the dunes, the reflective glimmers of scattered metal, and the shifting hues of sand under the changing light, transforming the landscape into a series of navigable cues, allowing her to move with both caution and control, while he monitored her progress closely, ready to provide support or subtle correction as needed. Nira began to anticipate changes instinctively, her gaze scanning for texture, shadow, and color, interpreting the environment with increasing independence, and Ethan noticed the subtle shifts in her posture and movement, the small, confident adjustments signaling a growing mastery of her surroundings, a quiet acknowledgement of both her own developing skill and the reliability of his guidance. Together, They continued along the ridge with synchronized steps, the interplay of instruction, observation, and action reinforcing their partnership, the warmth of the sun soft against their skin, the glinting reflections from debris marking safe paths, and the shared focus establishing a trust built on presence, patience, and careful attention to the world around them. Each step forward solidifying the fragile but growing alliance as the desert stretched out, vast, unpredictable, yet increasingly navigable through observation, awareness, and deliberate collaboration. The late afternoon sky began to shift, streaks of orange and deepening violet stretching across the horizon, and Ethan Carter carefully guided Nira Solis through a narrow passage between two jagged ridges. The uneven sand and scattered metallic debris forcing each step to be deliberate, measured, and mindful of balance. He spoke softly, narrating the subtle changes in terrain, the angles of the sand, the reflective glints from fragmented panels, and the gentle inclines that could hide sudden drops, helping her anticipate and navigate the environment with growing skill, while she responded by shifting her weight precisely, adjusting her steps according to his guidance, and observing the cues he highlighted with focused attention, her breathing steady, her posture more confident, and the tension that had marked her initial movements gradually giving way to a controlled awareness of surroundings. Ethan paused to point out distant formations and to demonstrate subtle techniques for distributing weight, avoiding fatigue, and maintaining stability, while Nira mirrored his motions, absorbing the methodology and learning to integrate observation with action, each step a lesson in patience, attentiveness, and trust. The rhythm of their movements beginning to synchronize into a quiet cadence that spoke of cooperation and mutual understanding. The wind stirred fine grains of sand, reflecting the light in tiny flickers across her iridescent skin, and Ethan used these visual cues to illustrate the subtle interactions between environment and movement, explaining how shifts in light, shadow, and texture could inform decisions about balance and pathfinding, while Nira responded intuitively, gradually internalizing the principles he demonstrated, her eyes following the angles of panels and ridges, calculating distances and slopes, and subtly adjusting her posture without hesitation. As they reached a plateau that offered a broader view of the desert beyond, Ethan guided her to a stable position, adjusting the thermal blanket around her shoulders, and spoke of distant landmarks, the gentle undulations of dunes, and reflective fragments that indicated the safest route forward, reinforcing her situational awareness and encouraging independent assessment while remaining within a safe range of support. The soft hum of residual energy from nearby wreckage, the whisper of shifting sand, and the occasional creak of distant debris created a layered sensory environment that anchored their attention and reinforced focus, and Nira began anticipating changes in the landscape, responding to cues before they became obstacles, a subtle smile crossing her lips as she recognized the efficacy of observation and guidance, the synergy between them deepening with each carefully measured step. Together they continued along the ridge, their movements deliberate and synchronized, Ethan providing steady instruction and subtle correction, Nira applying the lessons instinctively, the light shifting across the desert painting the landscape in warm hues, and the rhythm of breath, steps, and attention forming an unspoken connection, a fragile but growing bond of trust, awareness, and mutual reliance, leaving both alert and prepared for the next stage of their journey through the vast, unpredictable terrain that stretched endlessly before them, each step forward reinforcing their partnership and the careful alliance forged in patience, guidance, and shared focus. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the dunes and scattered metallic debris, and Ethan Carter guided Nira Solis across a gently sloping ridge that led to a small plateau, the uneven terrain demanding careful attention to each step, the crunch of sand and occasional metallic shift beneath their feet marking their progress, while he spoke softly, describing subtle changes in elevation, shadow, and the position of reflective fragments to help her anticipate and navigate safely. Nira's iridescent green skin caught the sunlight, her eyes alert and scanning, her posture confident yet cautious, and she adjusted her weight and stance precisely, applying the guidance Ethan provided, her breathing steady, each movement reflecting growing awareness, understanding, and trust in both her own abilities and in Ethan's presence. He paused periodically to point out distant landmarks, subtle undulations in the sand, and small reflective markers among the debris, explaining how these could indicate safer routes or shifts in footing, while encouraging her to observe, think ahead, and integrate each observation into her movement, allowing her to gain autonomy over her actions while remaining under his guidance. The ambient hum from residual energy sources and the whisper of wind across scattered panels created a layered auditory backdrop, reinforcing concentration and situational awareness, while the shifting light across metal fragments and sand provided visual cues that both Ethan and Nira used to maintain balance, anticipate changes, and coordinate movements, the rhythm of their steps forming an unspoken cadence that communicated trust, attention, and mutual understanding. As they approached the plateau, Ethan adjusted the thermal blanket around her shoulders and guided her to a stable position, the sunlight highlighting the contours of her form and reflecting off scattered panels in a kaleidoscope of soft colors. And he spoke quietly of distant ridges, subtle patterns in the sand, and changes in light that might indicate upcoming challenges, reinforcing the importance of observation, patience, and deliberate movement. And Nira absorbed each instruction with focused attention, her movements precise, deliberate, and confident. Together they navigated the plateau, their synchronized rhythm of observation, instruction, and response deepening, each step forward a careful combination of awareness, trust, and skill, while the heat and light of the afternoon painted the desert in warm hues, emphasizing contours, shadows, and subtle environmental cues that informed their decisions and guided their path. The shared silence between them was filled with the soft ambient sounds, the shifting sand, distant echoes, and occasional metallic creaks, creating an atmosphere where focus, observation, and subtle communication became their language, and Nira's trust in Ethan's guidance solidified into a quiet confidence, her gaze alert and engaged, anticipating the next steps as she internalized the lessons of the terrain, balance, and attention to detail. By the time they reached the far edge of the plateau, the vast desert stretched out below them, the light reflecting off distant dunes and metal shards, and both felt the quiet satisfaction of mastery over the immediate environment. The careful collaboration between human and alien having forged a bond of trust, attentiveness, and shared experience that would sustain them for the challenges yet to come as the sun dipped lower, casting long, golden shadows and highlighting the fragile but strong alliance that had grown through patience, guidance, and deliberate mutual awareness. The sun had dipped low, painting the desert in molten gold and soft violet hues, and Ethan Carter and Nira Solis stood atop the highest plateau they had reached, the vast expanse of dunes and scattered metallic wreckage stretching endlessly before them, every shadow and reflective glint revealing the lessons of the terrain they had learned together. Ethan adjusted the thermal blanket around her shoulders, the gentle movement both practical and reassuring, and Nira's green eyes met his, a quiet acknowledgement of trust and shared experience, their breathing synchronized with the subtle rhythm of the desert wind, the soft hum of distant residual energy blending with the whisper of shifting sand, creating a serene yet attentive atmosphere. Together they scanned the horizon, noting distant ridges and subtle shifts in light that hinted at patterns in the landscape, the culmination of careful observation, deliberate movement, and patient instruction. And Ethan spoke softly of the journey they had undertaken, emphasizing how attention, patience, and awareness could transform a harsh, unpredictable environment into a navigable space, while Nira absorbed each word, her posture reflecting confidence, focus, and a newfound understanding of her own capabilities. As the golden light faded into deeper violet, the reflective shards scattered across the dunes catching the last rays, Ethan guided her through the final small steps toward a secure position, demonstrating balance, weight distribution, and the nuanced interpretation of light and shadow, while Nira mirrored his movements with precision, the culmination of trust, instruction, and mutual engagement evident in the smoothness of her steps and the alertness of her gaze. They paused, surveying the plateau and the path ahead, the quiet between them filled with the subtle cues of their environment, the shifting sands, the low hum of remaining energy sources, the gentle flicker of light off scattered panels. And in that shared silence, a profound understanding had developed, a bond forged not through words but through deliberate guidance, careful observation, and the steady cultivation of trust, awareness, and patience. A fragile alliance now strengthened by experience and mutual reliance. Ethan spoke again, softly, pointing out distant formations and patterns, not as instruction but as reflection, highlighting the continuity of observation and learning, while Nira listened, nodding slightly, her body relaxed yet attentive, her eyes following his gestures, aware of how far she had come from the initial moments of fear and caution to this present balance of awareness, skill, and trust. Together they looked out across the endless desert, the light fading, shadows lengthening, reflecting on the journey they had shared, each step forward a testament to the deliberate care, patient instruction, and quiet courage that had guided them, leaving both poised on the edge of the vast, unpredictable landscape with confidence, understanding, and the quiet satisfaction that came from navigating it together. The final moment suspended in the delicate interplay of light, shadow, wind, and the unspoken bond between human and alien, a culmination of trust, guidance, and awareness that would endure beyond the plateau and into the journey that awaited them beyond the horizon.